Well, hey,
Good
everybody.
morning, everyone. We are Katie and Kurt, as
We are.
Stanley said. We are the co-lead pastors of this church. We've also been married for 17 and a half years.
You
That's good.
hesitated.
I passed.
Yeah, that's good. You got it. Yeah.
Together for a little over 20 years,
Yeah.
in some way, shape, or form. But we are thrilled to be here. We love, it's like the honor of our lives to get to be a part of this incredible community that is marked by so many of you who love and serve and invest in it. Thank you, thank you. And today, we're continuing this series of conversations, which I've loved this series. We're talking about this idea of made for this, about relationships as the currency of our human experience, isn't it? Last week, we talked a little bit about, how to be known in relationships. And the week before that, Kurt actually talked on how we are created for community. And as Stanley mentioned, we're going to be doing a little bit of a deeper dive today on marriage. And regardless of what stage you find yourself in, whether you're married, whether you're hoping to one day be married, whether you've been married and you're healing from that experience, whether your marriage would say, whether you'd say it's thumbs up, thumbs down, thumbs in the middle, wherever you fall on that spectrum, we hope today is going to be a blessing to you. We hope that through sharing some of our mistakes and some of our wins, we hope that will be a gift that helps you give some handles on what does God actually say about marriage? What did God design it to be? We know that oftentimes the church has given sometimes ranging anywhere from confusing to convoluted picture and messaging around marriage, and we can all acknowledge that we actually need an honest and helpful conversation around this, because it is so important, because it is so common as humans to get it wrong or to hurt one another, even though that's not our intention. And so we're going to shed some light onto that. Again, whatever season of life you find yourself in, that we desire for all of our relationships to be, as we've talked about the first 2 weeks, to be a reflection of love. Ultimately, that is what Jesus came to earth to model for us, is that it's not about religious rule keeping, it's not about getting it right to appease God, it's ultimately about being formed into the image of Jesus and reflecting that love to all of the relationships in our lives. So, again, we're hopeful that by sharing some of this real stuff in our life, that it will help you as you navigate your relationship reality.
And lucky for them, we have all the answers.
Totally.
Which is great.
We have figured it out, guys.
Yeah.
Just kidding. Totally not.
So this series, obviously about relationships, we can often kind of zoom in and assume we mean romantic relationships, and that certainly has not been the case. Friendships, coworker relationships, neighborhood relationships, all of those are very, very important. And they're important to God. They're important to us as individuals. But today, as we zoom in on marriage specifically, how we can have a full and filling marriage, our hope is that after today, there was to be this desire stirred up in you, perhaps, to have a life-giving marriage at some point. If you're married, perhaps with the person that you're currently married to, that would be great. If you're seeking to get married, to long for the kind of marriage that would actually be filling and honoring to you and to your partner and to God, to have this marriage experience that you go through actually not be the goal of your life, but be a tool that God might use to help you to grow and to lead you ultimately to the life to the fullest kind of experience that Jesus promised us. And so whether, like Katie said, you are already married, wishing to be married, wishing you got married yesterday, if you're dating, if you want the current dating relationship that you're in to be more than just a hookup, but actually matter long term, if you're hoping it leads somewhere, or if you've been married and wondered what the heck happened, how can I make sure that doesn't happen again, today hopefully is going to be helpful for you. So it is important that we mention from the start, I joked and I need to clarify my joke, we do not have all the answers when it comes to marriage. However, we do hope that we can provide some anchors today, specifically from the scriptures as well as from our own life and what we've walked through many couples over the last couple decades. We have done a lot of work in our own marriage. We've been married for a significant period of time and gone through those ups and downs as well. We want to acknowledge that as we come to the scriptures, as we come to the concept of marriage, while there are many vantage points and many different experiences we come to it, we can only live within our own, right? Namely, heterosexual, cisgendered, married for the first time to each other, monogamous marriage, right? So that's the context with which we bring this conversation from. We've learned from so many of our incredible friends and leaders that have different experiences when it comes to marriage from, a biblical standpoint, as well as from just their own life. And that's been incredibly valuable. And we hope to honor that and speak to some of those nuances today. But we also still have to acknowledge we live within our own life, right? And while marriage is important to God because it impacts our life, it's just as important to mention that Jesus himself was never married. So marriage is not a necessity to arrive at some sort of spiritual, hierarchy destination, right? Getting married is not the goal of life, and it's certainly not the goal of following Jesus. That can be confusing if you spend any time in church. You would think that it might be. It doesn't make you a better follower of Jesus. And in fact, in Luke 20:34, Jesus was asked about this, so it's not a new tension. And he spoke to it specifically saying, marriage is actually a major preoccupation here, meaning like in the human experience, but not there, referring to life with God in eternity. But those who are included in the resurrection will no longer be concerned with marriage, nor, of course, with death, which he separated into two separate categories. So just to clarify, Jesus is very clearly saying marriage is fine, nothing wrong with it, but it's not this ultimate goal for your life. And so as we talk about it today, we just want to start by saying that up front, that so many of us are desirous of marriage, just like it was true in Jesus' culture, that it's absolutely worth talking about. And the Bible talks about it a lot because it impacts our life and God cares about your life. But it is certainly not God's goal for every single person. If you are married, God's goal is that you have a healthy and fulfilling marriage, but not that you absolutely have to get married.
Yeah, marriage, when we're looking at it from that vantage point of it is not a requirement for being a spiritually, mature follower of Jesus. It is designed to activate a deep and intimate part of us, deep and intimate part of our relationship with one another. And given that reality, can also be extremely fertile soil for transformation. It can reflect and mirror our relationship with God. It can expose desire, hunger, longing for the spiritual life that honestly, in our relationships with our human friendships, our human romantic relationships, that there's a parallel there that is worth paying attention. But it is not the end-all, be-all, finish line of relational maturity. And so as pastors, we've gained and hopefully given some wisdom over the last 18 years in ministry that we've been doing, pastoral ministry. And I don't know what it is about being pastors. It's like sometimes you'll be on a plane or we'll be just in some random setting and kind of the whole inevitable question of oh, so what do you do? And it's oh, I'm a pastor, and sometimes it's oh man, that just opens this whole door and all of a sudden people are sharing their whole life story and it's oh, okay.
But it either shuts down the conversation immediately.
It's kind of a polarizing. It's either awkward,
or we have to offer a free counseling session.
The next 3 hours and I just scored my new best friend. But there is this reality of our relationships and our spirituality, that there is a deep connection that God knows and realizes that throughout the good, bad, and the ugly and everything in between, that God intimately cares about that because he intimately cares about you. And me and us. He cares about our relationships thriving and bringing life and goodness into this world. So, in fact, just to take kind of a quick look over our society's recent history, we're going to kind of zoom back 60 years to the 1960s and look at the rate of marriages ending in divorce was 10%. And then in the span of 20 years, it climbed to 50% in the 80s and has kind of hovered there. The divorce rate has kind of hovered around 50% ever since the 80s. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that couples were happier in the 1960s. I'm not going on record saying that. Please don't blast me on Instagram. But we do see that each new generation, right, coming from the 60s, our older boomers and into, the 80s, and now into today, as society has progressed, we have over time had a less stable picture of marriage. We've had a more fluid and flexible picture of family and connectedness, and that each generation has grown up looking a little bit different from decade to decade. And so to just name the reality of, I fall into the 50% of divorced blended family. My parents, I'm so grateful, did the best they possibly could, and it was actually kind of a good situation for our family. God brought the best possible out of the situation. But Kurt falls into the 50% of parents whose marriage is still intact, and it was their first and only marriage. So this is like another dynamic that impacts us in deep ways. I'm sure everyone in the room, you have your own story when it comes to that as well. And then another staggering new study that we found in 2022 during those first few years of the pandemic, the divorce rate actually jumped from 50% to 58%. I wonder why. Some of us are maybe still like twitching, thinking back to those years. We're like, I wonder why. Were we a little stressed? Maybe.
I wish we were closer. Not that close.
I wonder what that like communal trauma, still unpacking that for years to come. But for those couples, to zoom down a little bit more, for couples who had been married less than 6 months, so any of those newlywed, here we are living in a global pandemic, their divorce rate almost tripled. Out of that demographic, the divorce rate went from 11% to 28%. And then additionally, 65% of men and 55% of women experienced throughout that time some kind of an affair, a pornography addiction, or the ending of a serious relationship. Maybe it wasn't quite a marriage, but maybe a cohabiting or, a dating relationship. So statistically, that is more of us than not who have experienced some kind of relational turmoil over these last couple of years. Those of us that maybe still have an intact marriage, it's still perhaps weathered or put us through the ringer, as some might say. So while we can't promise, a one-size-fits-all solution to a happy marriage, because just look around this room, each and every one of your relationships are unique. It's important to take a look at this, and take a look at the different ways that we often approach relationships, to uncover what some of our underlying expectations might be. Because if we boil down, any kind of conflict usually comes around some kind of unmet or miscommunicated expectations. Whether it comes to our marriages, our family relationships, coworkers, we can probably all attest to a situation where we had expectations, whether voiced or otherwise. Once they were not met, there we are. We're standing at the crossroads of a conflict. And so we're going to kind of jump in real fast. 3 types of relationships, all right? Not all of these apply to marriage, but in some dynamic, maybe you'll notice some distinctions in your relationships. The first is contractual. All right, a contractual relationship is boiled down to this: you do X and I will do Y. Right. All right, that's the kind of relationship that maybe you have with your barista. Right? I would like this tall oat milk extra shot latte, and I will give you the said $17 that it now costs for that latte. Right? You do this, I do this. It is very clear what the expectations are. It is agreed to. It's a contract. Maybe even, in a work context, it's written up. Maybe you've even signed the paper to agree to that contract. All right? So contractual agreements, contractual relationships are one type of relationship. Then we also have committed. All right? A committed relationship is that I commit to this for a period of time. All right, I commit to this for certain reasons, for a certain amount of time. Maybe even you look at a committed relationship, whether that's a dating relationship. Maybe it's a kind of first date in the early the early part of a relationship. Maybe there's still that like you might be committed, but it's sort of still like feeling it out, right? A committed relationship, maybe think of it like a gym membership, sort of. Maybe you have all the intentions of this being a long-term, deeply committed relationship. I'm feeling like, I'm kind of attacking myself right now. Maybe you started off the new year and you got 11 days into 2024 and you're like, well, that was a waste, the 30-day trial. I'm glad I didn't buy the whole gym membership, right? A committed relationship might have all the intention of it being healthy, it being good, it going the distance. But when it comes down to it, may or may not be a forever thing.
And the main difference between the contractual and committed is that committed has expectations, right? Like your barista's not going to be mad if they don't see you tomorrow.
Right.
They might notice, but they're not going to do anything.
Yeah,
Whereas
that
you have a
wasn't part of
trainer,
the agreement.
right? With part of the agreement. Trainer at the gym, you skip, they might call you.
Totally.
Right?
Exactly. Right. So the third kind of relationship is a covenant, right? A covenant. Maybe if you've been to a wedding or you've been around church, maybe you've heard marriage referred to as a covenant, or maybe you've heard God talking about his people of this is the new covenant. A covenant relationship says, even if you don't, I still will. Right? Even if you fail, even if you don't meet my expectations, even if you have a bad day, even if our life takes us on twists and turns that we didn't expect, right? For better or worse, all the things, right? That's what marriage vows are, is making a covenant, beyond a commitment. It's saying that even if you don't, I still will. And this, a covenant relationship, is actually what best displays the heart of God. It influences how you get through the things that you're committed to, when you're committed to staying together come what may. And so as we look at these kind of three different relationships in the context of what God designed a marriage to be, God designed a marriage to be something that weathers the storms, that it's beyond just contractual. It's deeper than just commitment. It is actually takes more than just our human ability to live out this kind of covenant relationship. And so we're not advocating, just want to go on record here, that we're not advocating for an unhealthy or a toxic or even an abusive, unfulfilling marriage to keep going, well, you promised, so it's a covenant, you're stuck for life. We're advocating for God bringing the fullness of what covenant was meant to be, rather than simply admitting, many of us, we've had our failures. We've had our expectations that haven't been met. And for some of us, looking back to, July 1st, 2006, that was a day that we promised, through better or worse, richer or poorer, and God has really tested some of those promises that we promised on that day, that no matter what we face, that we're going to be there for each other. We're going to keep showing up. And so rather than saying, all right, well, what happens when I feel stuck? What happens when it starts to feel more like roommates than lovers? Is there a better way? Is there something that God has to say about marriage, that while it may be unexpected, while it may feel counterintuitive at first to approach our relationships in this way, that ultimately searching for a love that will last is something that God invites all of us who are married to put at the forefront of our relationship, the forefront of our goals. The truth is we have to be okay with asking that, is there something that we can begin doing today that can help us have hope in the face of all of these statistics that I just shared about 2022, about, the marriage ending in divorce hovering at 50%. Like, is that just something that we accept, or is there more that God is inviting us into?
Yeah. And I think for many of us, right, when we've had those experiences, right, many of us in this room, like Katie mentioned, our combined family has those baked into it. It's really important that we understand the goal of this is not just to stay together, right? The goal is how to have a fulfilling marriage, right? A full and filling marriage. And so perhaps it may even be triggering to some to hear the phrase like, oh, God designed marriage, because you think back to your first marriage or you saw your parents' marriage and you're like, surely God can do better than that. Like that wasn't the goal, right? But all of those things that impact us show up in our lives, are in the room right now. And so it's important to name those things and to begin from a very clear understanding of we bring all of those experiences with us into whatever relationship we are trying to create. And so for some of you in the room, you're dating, you're seeking marriage, either directly with perhaps the person that you're with one day in the future, or maybe down the line in a more ethereal sense. there's a part of this message that we hope is clear for you, that you ask some different questions perhaps than you have before as you're analyzing and assessing your relationship, that you actually wouldn't say, hey, I'm willing to settle just for someone, but I actually want a full and fulfilling marriage. And for others of us in the room that are married, maybe you find yourself in a stable place, but it's kind of stuck. Maybe even like, it's just kind of whatever, it just exists. Maybe you would have a desire leading into your life following today where you're craving a deeper sense of connection with your spouse. You say, you know what, there's got to be more than what we're experiencing. How can we go for that together? Maybe you'd find yourself in a place where you're really struggling in your marriage. And our hope is that there would be hope and healing that could be offered today. And maybe you find yourself, we're happy, we're doing good, like things are going fine, but we don't know why exactly. And that hopefully what we learn from the scriptures today would move us into a place where we know, hey, future success and future happiness in our marriage is actually something that we can clarify and work towards together if we choose to do that, right? Because here's the thing, all of those things that you taught so well on last week about what does it mean to be known play into this desire for romantic relationships for all of us, right? If I don't know myself and if I don't know how to allow another to know me, I automatically set the cap of what our marriage can experience. And that's true for all of us, right? And so if you didn't check that message last week, shameless plug, go get it on our YouTube page. But I think the reason is because what we look for in a partner is often the reflection of what we desire most in ourselves. Right? Like we want someone that's going to be trustworthy because ultimately at some level we want to be trusted and be trustworthy. I want someone who's going to desire me because honestly, like I want to be desired, and so I want someone that I find desirable as well. I want someone to think, hey, you know what, Kurt has what it takes. I want Katie to believe that I have what it takes in whatever scenario we're going after in our life, because if I'm honest, the rest of the minutes of every day, I'm not so sure if I do, right? So we all have this thing where we look for in a partner what we actually desire for ourselves, and none of us want to be second place in our relationships, right? All of us want to be prioritized, poured into. None of us want to be in competition with something in our spouse's life that takes them away from us, right? Like she doesn't want to compete with your car. You don't want to compete with her job. You don't want to compete with their income. You don't want to compete with their friends or her family, right? You want to be pursued and prioritized. You want to feel wanted. You want to feel valued and attractive. And all of those things are actually really good things, just to be clear, right? Those things are actually reflections of the image of God at work within us. And so the question is, what do we do with that? How do we go and try to find that kind of life with someone while still doing our own work, right? And the thing is, we don't want to just like say, hey, I'm just going to give and give and give no matter what happens and be a doormat. Like when you hear what Katie was just saying, maybe that's what comes to your mind from your experience, right? Like that there's this restlessness that rattles around in your soul of going, well, how do I get what I want or need if I pursue this thing we're going to talk about? If I'm just a giver in a relationship, how do I actually receive in return? And so that's a really important question. And especially if you're here and you're not married and you're pursuing that with someone, and if you notice that the more and more you give, the more and more they take and take and take and never return the favor, I would suggest you run. So, and find another relationship. But that's important to really notice what happens in our life when we feel that way. And wherever you find yourself, you might have a proclivity one way or the other to lean into that. But I think it's important to acknowledge that's an important trigger that we have to name when it comes to our relationships.
Yeah. And, for those of us who are in, a covenant relationships, for those of us who you've made this promise, you've leaned in, you said, I'm going to spend the rest of my life with this person. If you start noticing some of those spaces where maybe you feel not trusted, or maybe you feel like, not prioritized, or maybe you feel even in your relationship, that urge, that desire to run, right? What is the other option in those moments where we feel like we're in a relationship and there's this duality? There's these two different push-pull realities going on. Do we just stay busy? I mean, that's always an option. Do we just pour time into the gym or more time into golf or more time at work or more time into the kids, just keeping ourselves busy with girls' trips or something that just keeps your lives, you're still together, but maybe you're starting to notice that there is just everything in your life is just filling up space. There's this busyness that is keeping you not apart, but if we're honest, we can sometimes fill our lives and fill our priorities, and we're not leaving the relationship. And, oftentimes this can be an incredibly painful thing to feel like all of a sudden we've gone from this closeness to now there's all of these things that aren't necessarily bad things, but if they start getting in between our oneness, that's where some problems can kind of start to show up. Things like, where you're just feeling like you're going through the motions, or that we're just ships passing in the night. I know the more kids that have gotten added to our, little crew, the more that temptation is real to just start building our life around all of these activities and kind of just losing sight of one another. And that can eventually lead to, maybe not in a actual sense, but sometimes maybe can lead to maybe I'm just going to go find someone else, right? Maybe I'm just going to, this relationship isn't fulfilling anymore. Maybe I'm just going to go find something new. And the problem with that is that you go wherever you go, right? That if there is this tendency, if there is this unrealized, if there is this subconscious pattern in your life, whatever part of the relationship problem that you were with that person follows you into every new relationship that you are in. And just because someone else couldn't fulfill your hopes, your dreams, your wishes, what makes us think that we're going to go find that with somebody else or with somebody new? This is generally not the answer, because the truth is that people don't rush into a new relationship because they're eager to just start giving their lives to someone new, right? And the truth is that it can be easy to fantasize about how life could be so much easier with someone else, but rather than doing the work to actually become a better person, right? So often the tendency is to try and run to find something new, whether it's another person or another thing, rather than turning our view to ourselves. Because let's be honest, we know that when we get away from it, that it's in those moments that the whirlwind of our relational world can get so derailed so easily, because we believe this lie that a promise and a party, right? That one day on July 1st, 2006, right? We believe that is all it takes to make a successful marriage. And the truth is that it just does not, right? Making a promise is great. Throwing a party is great. I love a wedding. That's one of my favorite things, right? But ultimately, that is not the fullness. That is not the fulfilling marriage. A full and filling marriage requires preparation, practice, and persistence, right? It's the continual showing up. It's continual prioritization of that person. And so how do we make this shift, right? How do we shift our understanding into this big idea, right? This is something that we talked about at our marriage retreat that we actually did this last fall. And we wanted to kind of recycle this big idea because we think it's so important, right? And here it is. It's that you are the only legitimate source of romance in your spouse's life, right? I'm the only legitimate source of romance in Kurt's life, right? The only legitimate source of affection and love and support and affirmation. And so it is human nature, friends, that if we are not prioritizing the other person, it is human nature to go around looking for that validation from somewhere. All right. And so prioritizing our person, taking the time to get to know what those needs are, helps us to keep our prioritized, to keep our marriage protected and safe from anything that could come in and steal our focus away from the one person that is our person.
And I think it's important when you hear that to ask yourself the question, when I hear that phrase, do I think, oh, well, they should certainly get on it and do better? Or do we take that as a personal invitation? Because that reaction that you have, we don't know, it's just a question to pose, is going to tell you a lot about your posture towards your partner, right? And while it is true that that idea of you are the only legitimate source of romance in your spouse's life, if they don't find it from you, they will find it somewhere else with books or websites or the person at work or whatever it might be, right? That also is an invitation to say, okay, what does that mean in how I'm allowing them to become that for me, right? And so for the nature of this, we're going to do a little experiment, which will be fun. So this idea of a full and filling marriage, like we should do a water.
I know, this seems like a good idea.
Yeah, it's a good.
Let's bring some water on stage.
Yeah, it's great. Love it. No cords on the ground. So, if you picture your life in your marriage with your spouse as a watering can, right? This is you. You can be filled. You can be filling, right? We'll put water in just a second, right? It would be so great if we all came to our marriages just clean and whole and just perfect specimens of humanity, right? If we could be for each other the way God sees us, wouldn't that be wonderful? I mean, you would love it if you saw your spouse the way God saw your spouse and they saw you the way God sees you. That would absolutely drastically improve our relationships. The problem is that she sees me the way I am, flaws and all, and same with her. They're harder to find on that side, but at least for me. So the reality is that you actually come into your relationship, and this isn't a put down. You are fearfully, wonderfully made in the image of God, but because life is real, you come into any relationship as you are. Holes, scars, with a little bit of baggage, right? Maybe a lot of baggage. And the quicker we are to know that about ourselves, the better off our marriage will get. And so as your relationship gets more and more serious, and as your life gets more and more filled up in that relational world, your holes begin to be exposed. And over time, you can be like, oh my gosh, what's happening? How do I fill my partner's life while I'm dripping? Wait. I'm frustrated. Please, I need you to fill me up, right? And this is how we can pursue our relationships, right?
All right. But sometimes, if we're all honest, oh my gosh, I'm making mess. Sometimes when we realize that something is going on, that something's not quite right in our relationships, let's see. Maybe we can put a Band-Aid on it. Wait, you need one too, or let's see if that helps. But then life gets a little bit more demanding.
Yeah, we talked about
it. Maybe we add some kids.
Went on marriage retreat.
We went on a marriage retreat. Oh no! But the more full my life gets, the more I'm realizing we should go to
empty,
therapy.
Babe. Would you fill me up?
We should go to marriage counseling. This isn't just a Band-Aid. Busting out the duct tape for this one. All right. Shameless plug for marriage counseling. All right. Let's see if this helps. Okay. Wait. Got some duct tape.
Perfect.
All right. Here we go. Does that make it?
Yeah, great. Thanks for filling me up. This is
awesome.
Everything's great for like 6 months.
Everything's awesome until the Band-Aid.
The Band-Aid's
oh no.
leaking. I found out something else. And so again, you get the idea, right? It's silly, it's funny, right? I'm making a mess.
We made a mess.
It happens.
Hey.
Okay. But here's the thing is as we go through our relational lives, especially like he said, as relationships get more and more important, they naturally get more and more complicated. And they naturally get more and more demanding. And so when we think, I can just do the same thing over and over again, and it will make everything better. Are you getting this off the stage before it makes a big mess?
No.
It'll be fine.
Fine.
We can think, if my spouse would just, or hey, this is me, love it or leave it, and then they choose to, right? Like you have those moments where things can get really, really difficult. And we have found this in our own life multiple times, right? And it could be big things, it could be small things. I remember we about 3 years into marriage, we were going home from being at my parents' house for the holidays. We lived out in the Midwest at the time. And we had this conversation where you said, hey, I've noticed something, I want to talk to you about it. And I'm just like, you're going to tell me how great I am? I can't wait. Let's do this. Let's have this conversation in public. And it unfortunately was not what I expected, right? And I said, hey, like whenever we're at your parents' house, like within a couple yards of the front door, you kind of disappear for a while. And you kind of leave me to fend for myself. And I often find you helping your parents outside or in the kitchen or whatever. And it's challenging. I feel abandoned. And I'm like, I don't know what to do with that information, right? And luckily, it was presented to me in a way I could hear it and was loving and compassionate, but was challenging nonetheless. And what we discovered in conversations is that when I would go home, I would jump immediately back into the relationship posture I best knew how to handle in that environment, which was being the oldest son. And so I was the helper. And what I didn't know how to do was navigate this new relational reality where now not only was I a son, I was also a husband. And that there was some prioritization that needed reshuffling in my life.
Yeah. And, to share another example for me, the fuller our bucket got, the more, fast forward about 10 years or so from that point in our, realization of where our water line was, the more full our bucket got, the more I realized, hey, all right, now we're parents of a couple of young kids, and our kids are reaching the age where I was when my folks split. And all of a sudden, there's this underlying thing that anytime we are having just normal, marriage fights, but anytime the kids are around, I notice it activate and trigger something in me, this protective mama bear instinct that wants to shield them from seeing fighting between us because of some deeper healing that I was needing to do in my grief journey of naming and of healing and of saying, this was my reality, but we have this invitation to do the work, heal, grieve, so that I can bring a more compassionate version of myself that can both contain and give confidence and reassurance to my kids, but also as a wife, be able to show up in those spaces to encourage them that, hey, Mom and Dad, we're going to argue sometimes. That doesn't mean you need to be worried about this. But that took a lot of realization and learning for me to not just freak out and to become flooded with emotion and to either fight or flight my way through these, or to turn blame on you instead of not wanting to be real human in front of my kids. So you see how the levels of awareness as we do this work, as marriage, as you go from being a married couple to maybe a married couple with kids, or to eventually being a married couple as empty nesters, or then maybe grandkids come into the picture. You see how the levels of complexity of our relationship matters. It's worth doing that work to know one another.
Yeah, and so as we talk about this, I think it's important to go that there is one relational principle that we see throughout the scriptures that becomes incredibly helpful when it comes to how do you actually do this? How do you actually practically move into a place that you can have a full and filling marriage? And like Katie said earlier, it's pretty counterintuitive. It's not what we would perhaps expect. And then there's plenty of great talks on boundaries. There's plenty of great talks on romance and all that stuff that we're absolute fans of. And so as we think about how we talk about what's the one thing we want people to get when it comes to one-day marriage talk, not knowing everyone's story, everyone's situation, what's the best single thing we would hope that you could leave today with, knowing no matter where you're at on the relational spectrum or spiritual spectrum, it really is the encouragement that the Apostle Paul gave to the Philippian church in Philippians chapter 2. And it's not specifically marriage advice, although it is great marriage advice. And he says it this way. He says, in your relationships, all your relationships, but in your marriage, right, have the same attitude that Christ Jesus had. Like, be like Jesus, would you? Like, pretty good encouragement, right? It says, though he was God, he did not think of equality with God as something to cling to. That he was not like grabbing for his rights as the Son of God as he walked around the planet. He wasn't having this pompous posture of, if you all knew who I really was and how good you have it, which he easily could have, but that wasn't his posture. As Paul is writing to these people who had heard about Jesus, he's helping them understand, hey, this is what Jesus was like in real time. So instead, he gave up his divine privileges and took a humble position. He took a humble position. And he goes on to explain ways that we can do this in our relationships. And ultimately, this idea isn't just a one passage that we cherry picked for a message. This idea of being like Jesus, specifically when it comes to relationships, by submitting, by serving, by taking a humble posture, not on one side or the other, gender specifically, like just to be clear, like that is not actually what the Bible teaches, but all of us in relationship to serve and submit to one another, to find ways to engage in our relationship in such a way where it's like, actually, let's let's think about what you want to do. Like, this was all throughout the scriptures. We made a slide with just a smattering of a couple that we could find. There were plenty more, but this is all the places that, this is not even all the places that is listed, this idea throughout the scriptures. And specifically in the New Testament, as people were looking back to their experiences with Jesus, this idea came up over and over and over and over again of, hey, in your relationship, the best way to show up like you're growing to love and follow Jesus is defined by humility. It's defined by serving. It's defined by submitting. That there's this elegant invitation from the Apostle Paul to these people that are gathering in Philippi, trying to love and follow Jesus, saying, hey, if you would just do this, your relationships would become incredibly more valuable and more God-honoring and more fulfilling. And it is counterintuitive to think that actually pouring out, offering something to someone else, right, is the way to be filled myself, right? I know that for many of you, you're like, listen, I tried that. Like, that's not how it went down, right? And I understand that there is not a perfect plan included in this passage. But what Paul is saying that comes to your relationship is, even if you find out by doing this that that's not the right person for you to be with, you will become more fulfilled in the process because you won't be stuck in a relationship that isn't mutual and isn't reflecting the heart of God for us. So when he gives us that encouragement, he says, ultimately, the reason we're doing this, it's not for them, it's not for her, it's not for him. It's ultimately because of the model of Jesus that we have said, I want, for those of you that have decided to love and follow Jesus, this is what his model looks like. To say, I want to find a way to serve my spouse.
Yeah, and that humility, I would say for us, that is a thing that we have come back to time and time again. If you did not get a chance to screenshot that last slide, I would say do that, because that is an incredible list of places where Kurt said, overarching throughout the New Testament, we see not just through the life of Jesus, but through the followers, the disciples, the apostles who then wrote down the things that Jesus said and the things that the other disciples did. I mean, this is everywhere. You cannot miss this invitation to humility. And I love the way that Ephesians 5 actually says this in a more contextualized instruction to the early church, to these followers of Jesus that were trying to figure out not only how to do community after Jesus had gone and given them the Holy Spirit and say, now this Holy Spirit will teach you and instruct you in everything that you'll ever need. And right, so as they're figuring this out with one another, Paul pens this in a letter to the church in Ephesus. He says, submit to one another out of reverence for Christ. Right? Submit. Now, if you're anything like me, you hear the word submit and you kind of like,
you love it.
Whoa, you bristle up a little bit. Maybe that kind of, doesn't land. Maybe it hits different now in 2024 than it did there. But at the time when Paul was actually instructing this early church, he goes on to kind of spell it out, different responsibilities for wives and for husbands. The fact that Paul was even addressing women and teaching women, that was a countercultural shift towards actually including women who were considered property in the Greco-Roman culture of their time, to actually address them as equal members of the community. This wasn't many people growing up in church, maybe you've seen this as kind of a putting the women in their place as subservient. This was actually Paul including a more equal view of two spouses within a relationship. And so hopefully you all can kind of like draw some of those comparisons, that when we are actually submitting to one another, when we are actually loving one another as Christ loved the church, when we have this dynamic to where each of us are putting the other's needs before ourselves, that is the magic, friends. That is where we start to see our needs being met. If we're both prioritizing one another, then our needs are going to be met. If we're both paying attention to the verbal and nonverbal cues of our partner, of our spouse, then we are able to see God form the likeness of Christ within our marriage. And so here's what this all boils down to, is that a full and filling marriage is a mutual submission competition, right? That if we are both submitting to one another out of reverence for Christ, we are mutually submitting to one another, right? That is how our marriage goes from this fear of my needs not being met to now there's this overflow. Now we're out of scarcity mentality. We're living in the abundance of what God intended marriage and covenant to be. And so that is the invitation for every single one of us, right? Because we know that our marriages aren't perfect. I'll be the first to admit our marriage is not perfect. I've got my problems. He's got his problems. We are a work in progress. Neither of us is expecting perfection from one another. But what mutual submission invites us into is this idea of that it's not a me problem. My problems are not just my problems anymore. Kurt's problems are not just Kurt's problems anymore, right? When we're in this kind of unified covenant relationship, it's no longer just a me problem. Now it's our problem. Now it's an us thing. And so our hope and prayer for all of you is that as we step into this invitation, right, this invitation from God, that maybe we start to ask some new questions, right? That maybe we start to look at our expectations, our hopes, our desires a little differently.
Yeah. And so just to give you some homework, and when this is whether you're married or not, we love giving homework around here. There's 2 questions that maybe you could ask one another on a date night this week, right? To actually engage in the conversation when you find yourself in the midst of a challenge or a problem or a space where you are just not getting traction, to ask these questions. What do we want? Hey, we keep fighting about parenting. We keep fighting about finances. We keep fighting about intimacy. We keep putting Band-Aids on these things. Well, we had the conversation and we went to that dumb church thing you invited me to, or we even did counseling, or hey, let's just have sex more, or whatever it might be. We've put the Band-Aids on. Have we actually talked about what this hole and this problem came from? What do we want? And then what are we willing to do about it together? Now, there might be differentiated tasks, but it's a together thing. There was a point in our life where Katie says, hey, I'm going to therapy. When are you going to go? When are you going to go? Like, you can't just continue to live off the contact high of my spiritual formation, right? And I'm like, oh, yeah, like that was mine to do, but we were about it together. And again, there's plenty of times we had examples of how we shouldn't have done it, and she could have done it better, but that was an example she got it right. We have these moments, right, where we say, what are we going to do about it together? And I wish we had a hose connected to our stage, because for this analogy only, but then after that we take it away. But it's this idea of most of the time we think there's a scarcity and limit amount that we're going to get filled up with. And so when I'm pouring out, the fear is, well, this is all I have. So I don't have anything else to give, and I'm leaking all over the place. I don't have much to give to you. What if I run out? And ultimately, what Paul is reminding us in all of these passages that we see throughout the scriptures, what these questions can hopefully give you the courage to pursue in your relationship, whether you're already married or seeking to pursue marriage together, is that ultimately when you are in relationship with God, it does not make your marriage or potential future marriage perfect and without its problems. That is not what we're saying. Hopefully you got that already, but just to be clear, Jesus doesn't make everything easier. But what it does promise is that you're connected to the source. What it does promise is that you have like a hose into your life with love and affirmation and connection and belonging, so that you can actually offer that to another person in a way that doesn't feel fear-based or draining, that you actually can stand in courage to say, I'm willing to do some of this work with you. It's given me the courage to stay in this and be together because I know who's with us. And so our hope and prayer for you really is that we would see marriages within Restoration Church become full and filling marriages, no matter what stage of marriage you might find yourself in. And one of our goals primarily is not to be the example to follow, but as Paul said somewhere else in the scriptures, to say, hey, you can follow me as I pursue Jesus. And so don't look to us for perfection. Hopefully learn from our mistakes. We have plenty to offer you. But to say, hey, we want to be a part of a community that says we're valuing this, we want to support this, and we want to run after this together. And so in just a moment, after we wrap up, while we're singing our last song together, we're going to be back in the corner at the cross where we have prayer every time we gather. But specifically today, obviously you can come back for anything that you need prayer about today. We would love to pray for you. But perhaps one of the ways you could practice this posture of humility is say, hey, I've been doing this on my own. Like we've been muscling this and trying to figure this out, and it's gotten us as far as we've gotten. And that might be in a good place, it might be in a tough place. But our hope is not that you would come to see us, but that we would love to pray for your relationship, your current relationship, your future relationship, whatever that might look like. We would love to speak the name of Jesus into whatever it is that you're facing as a couple or future couple. We would love to pray for you today. All right, so that's just an offer we put out there. And that might be a way to say, hey, you know what? I'm going to be humble enough to say I can't do this on my own anymore. That I actually need the source. I need the Spirit of God to be at work in my life, in your life, and in our relationship together. So we'd love to pray for you. We encourage you to ask those 2 questions this week, and then we're going to worship together.
Yeah. I'm going to invite you all to stand. One of the things that we do around here when we pray, kind of a uniqueness of our restoration community, is that we actually, if you feel comfortable, this is totally optional, we hold our hands open as just a way of saying, you know, I'm open. My heart's open. My mind is open. Whether you are a follower of Jesus, whether you're a skeptic, an atheist, or anywhere in between, to simply open your heart, to open your mind, and maybe even just put your body in that posture of saying, I'm open, God. I'm open to what you might do. And as we pray together, it's a simple way of just receiving from God whatever he desires to give to you today. So let's pray together. God, I thank you. I thank you that you, Jesus, came to earth as the embodiment of love, not with a punitive or punishing tone, but from a posture of love. Jesus, you desired to show us the way when we felt lost, when we got it wrong, when we misstepped in a way that was hurting us. Jesus, you came to right every wrong. You came to correct every injustice. And God, you came to bring healing. And so, Lord, as we stand with our hands open to you, God, we acknowledge that especially in this area of our relationships, in the area of our dating, and God, in the area of our marriage, we need you. We need you to do a work. We need you to do what we can't do for ourselves. We need your forgiveness. We need your healing. We need courage. We need a new way of looking at the world when we feel like our way is failing us, God. And we believe that, Jesus, you are in the business of restoring what's broken. You are in the business of healing our wounds. And so we just lean in, and God, we just ask for you to just bring a soundness and a centeredness. God, when our minds spiral into anxiety or when we spin off the rails, God, we need you to be the sound mind that brings us back, that calls us back into your presence, where we ultimately can be healed by your perfect and unfailing love. So God, I pray for all of the marriages here in the room, for the ones that are healthy, for the ones that are just stuck, for the ones that are maybe even in crisis. God, would you reveal to us over this next week one step to take, one new question to ask, one way of opening ourselves up to God, what you might desire for us. We submit ultimately to you, Jesus, because that is what you invite us to. We submit to one another out of reverence for you, Jesus. So I pray that that dynamic would come alive in our relationships, in our marriages throughout this week. As we seek you, as we pursue one another, form us more and more into the likeness of Jesus. Amen.